Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tadaima 2025. My name is Rob Busher, and I'll be moderating today's conversation with Minidoka Survivor Rodger Nogaki. Roger, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Well, I'm very glad to be able to do it.
We had a really great conversation a couple days ago, and I'm looking forward to kind of drawing on some of that as we share this. Some information about the book that you just recently released, as well as some of your stories from camp and other stories of the resettlement. And maybe you could just start by introducing yourself and giving us a little bit of background information on your family's journey before the war and then into Minidoka.
Okay. Well, my name is Rodger Nogaki. I was born Rodger Ken Nogaki, but actually on my driver's license it says Ken Rodger Nogaki because I don't know. My mother said my name was Rodger Ken. The birth certificate read Ken Rodger. So uh, I always tell people, uh, as long as you can call me whatever you want. I'll make it to dinner on time because that's the one thing that I like to do, and that's to eat. But on a serious note, I am I am of the Sansei generation. I'm the first son of the first son in our family to reach the shores of America, and that occurred back in 1880 when my grandfather Kenjiro Nogaki. I think he was about the third child in the family, and he wasn't the first son, so he was not um, subject to any beneficial considerations in Japan. So he ran away from home. He was 13 years old, and I often think back about the man, and I say, "Gee, how how could this guy, 13 years old, run away from home, come all the way across the ocean, not being able to speak the English language? He could only speak Japanese. He had no family, he had no friends on the boat or when he landed on the shores of in North America, which turned out to be British Columbia. He actually landed in on Vancouver Island in the city of Victoria City, uh, which is on the southern part of the Vancouver Island, and it's just north of what is now known as the state of Washington. And I, I was told by my uncles and aunts that Kenjiro asked the crew when they landed in Victoria City, he was all excited because they were saying they're in America. And America to those people at the time was North America. And they didn't understand that we had differences between different countries, and one was between British Columbia, which was Canada, and the Northwest, which was Seattle, and that's the territory that he landed in eventually. And what actually happened is that when he landed in Victoria City, he uh, he jumped off the boat and he got tied up with some eventually with some Japanese fishermen who had already been on the island there, and he survived for several years. We're not really sure how long he survived in Victoria City, but on one of my journeys to the West Coast, I had gone up to the city of Vancouver with my wife and uh, daughter and her husband, my oldest daughter Jen and her husband, and we went to the Japanese Nisei retirement home just north of Vancouver City. And there I went, they had a big library. So I went to the library And I said, I'd like to see if I talked to the librarian. I said, I'd like to see if you have any information about my grandfather who came here sometime around 1880. And um, uh, I'd like to know a little bit about him. Well, she looked in the book and she says, yeah, I was just reading over a book and it was a story about fishermen who were part of the Japanese fishing fleet up here. And they were on one particular island. I forget the name of the island. But on with this group, they had some people that disappeared. They don't know where they went. And she says, there's a story here about Kenjiro Nagaki, how he disappeared from the crew. They were wondering whatever happened and would somebody, if you ever see this story, would you write to us and let us know that he's okay or where he went or whatever you can about him. So I says, well, that's my uncle. He grandfather. He landed in Seattle, and the story that I got from the family was Kenjiro rowed a boat which he stole up in Victoria City there, and he he rode from island to island, going down the shores up there along the Sound, and he ended up in Seattle. And the story was at the time there was only about maybe about 1,000 people, Americans, that lived in that Northwest Territory, and that was Seattle. So I said, "Oh my goodness, this is my grandfather." Sure enough, and part of that story corresponded to things that I had read about him in a book called Mukashi Mukashi, which was written for the Japanese Buddhist church in Seattle. And the story said that they were looking for this young fisherman, and if anybody had news of him, they would like to know. So, what the story was is that Kenjiro was perhaps one of the very first settlers in the Northwest, the Japanese, and he worked on the the harbor, and he worked as a cook in an American style food restaurant right on the docks. And that's the story that I got. That was his first job. And when I did check with the author of Mukashi Mukashi, um, it verified that yeah, he did work in a restaurant, and he had several restaurants down in that territory around the docks. And he eventually uh, owned the house. He had two homes in Seattle. The first one was a like a summer residence. It was like a getaway place where it was, I think, maybe like a one room apartment, I guess you would call it. It was a place where he lived and he vacationed there. And that was probably around 1900. And in 1909, he did apply for and get permit to build a home, and he bought property to build a home on Yesler Way. And the lady that I spoke to at um, the Seattle building department she said, I think he's the first one that was issued a permit. And I had wondered about that because at that time, or shortly thereafter, there was a law that was written where Japanese nationals were considered ineligible aliens. And as an ineligible alien, you were not permitted any property. And you could never become a citizen, and you could never vote. And so I found that very interesting. But at any rate, he did buy that property in 1909, and that was the year that my father was born, and my grandfather at the time was um, pretty active in the Seattle community, and he ran a restaurant at the they called it the World's Fair, and it was a big fair that lasted about 2 years. And he got a notice. I've read his notice about welcoming him to the World's Fair activities. I think they called it Pacific Northwest Fair or something, and it was a big thing. And then millions of people, literally a couple of million people, came to that fair, and it represented the Northwest. I guess they were trying to get businesses and people actively interested in coming out there to settle and build a business and live there. And a lot of countries, foreign countries, participated in there. And his restaurant was at one of the main entrances to the fairgrounds, and it was called the Tokyo Cafe, and they spelled Tokyo Tokio, not
Mhm.
Yo, and I thought that that was interesting. But he did have that, and he was honorable Nogaki, Kenjiro Nogaki, and um, I thought that that was an interesting facet because the Japanese were never really very welcome um, wherever they came in the United States, and you could see that by the type of laws that affected us. And I tried to point that out in my book that I wrote about our immigration to this country. And I did it because everybody in the family says, "Oh, somebody's got to write this down and tell us the stories." And well, there's a couple of cousins that I have that are older than I am, and I used to talk to them always about the stories of the family and all. And they weren't necessarily direct Kenjiro Nagaki children. Uh, One of them was um, a granddaughter of Kenjiro Nagaki, and her brother was the oldest grandchild that he had, and he was also someone that um, I grew up knowing all my life, and that's um, um, uh, the Ota family, and and my oldest aunt, the first Nagaki grandchild, Kenjiro, and his wife, who I'll tell you about in a minute, and she was born in Japan. So she was not the first Nagaki born to American Nagaki born uh, family member, but she was the first grandchild of Kenjiro and Kua Nagaki, who was the grandmother. And Kua was quite a bit younger than Kenjiro, but Kenjiro came here 1880, came to the United States somewhere between 1883 and around 1889, and whatever the date was, he was in it at that period of time. But
It's pretty amazing
my
that
wife says I should take a pause.
it's pretty amazing,
She,
Roger.
I guess I'm talking too much.
Oh no, you're telling us some great stories, and
Well, I'm trying to give a thing background, Jane, of where we come from.
yeah, no, this is it's a really
So
good context, and I think just to comment on a couple of things that you talked about. It's remarkable that your grandfather arrived early enough that he could purchase land. I know that the state of Washington, I think 1920 is when they passed the alien land law, so he was able to purchase that land and build a family house.
I can hear you.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, I was saying, it's great context that you provided, and it's amazing that your grandfather arrived early enough to purchase land in the state of Washington. I believe 1920 is when the alien land law was passed in that state. So, for him to be able to purchase that land and build a family house, establish what it sounds like several successful businesses, and create this very stable foundation to raise a family. So it seems like that led to some stability that a lot of the later Issei didn't necessarily benefit from, who might have arrived a little too late into the Pacific Northwest to actually purchase the homes that they were living in. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, your parents, because it sounds like your father was born in 1909, and so he would have been in his 30s, right, by the time that the war began. And you were born just a couple years before World War II, was it
No,
1940?
I was actually born just before World War II. I was born in 1940, January 5th, 1940, and I think that my experience with World War II. I actually remember the first day that we went to the reception center, which was in Puyallup Fairgrounds, which is a suburb of Seattle itself. I think maybe about 15 minutes or so from downtown Seattle. It's not too far, or 15 miles. Um, yeah. So I remember the first day going to Puyallup, and I can remember the first day going into Minidoka because we came there by train. And Puyallup was interesting because I was just a little over 2 years old when we went to Puyallup, and um, my dad told me we were going to be going to a place where they had horses.
Hmm.
And so, I was 2 years old and I was very excited about seeing horses. And um, so I had very good memories of going to these places. And I think that that's because I had such extraordinarily strong parents. And I think that all those um, Nisei and Issei parents were really an extraordinary group of people, which I think a lot of us could learn a lot of good things from. And certainly, I'm sure you feel the same way, and I know my daughters feel the same way about us and all, because we did go through some unusual things that other people have not experienced. But I never realized myself until I was an adult as to how many people in this country have gone through very similar experiences in their family.
Hmm.
It's really amazing. But at any rate, to get back about my family, my mother and father, my father was the fifth child of Kenjiro and Kuwa Nagaki. And Kenjiro, of course, was born in 1867, and his wife was born in 1880 in Japan. And I'm not really sure how they got together over in Japan, but Kenjiro went over there a couple of times, several times. Um, I know that the second recorded um, um, entry into the United States by Kenjiro were made by 1892. And so Kenjiro had already been going back and forth to Japan. And one of the things, of course, was his reason for going to America was that there was land of opportunity and the streets were lined with gold. And I can remember several of my aunts and uncles and one of my cousins, two of my cousins, telling me that that's what he thought, that there was an opportunity to become very rich, and that he would, after he made money, he would go back to Japan and let everybody know how well he was doing, and he would retire early to Japan, and he'd be a rich man, and he would be able to take care of his family. Well, somehow or another, he married Kua in Japan in the late 1890s, had his first daughter December of 1900, December 1900. His first daughter was born, and she was a unusual person. She was at the time, considered to be a very large person. She was 5'3", and I think they say that she weighed like 175 pounds or something. So she was considered to be a very large woman. But the first American-born child was another one of my aunts, um, Aunt Takachan, and she never had any children, although she did marry a man in Harua-san, and he was a teacher. He was very well educated, and my all of the first four kids, Nagaki kids, were all girls, and they were all partially or entirely educated in Japan. So they all spoke the language. They all were um, able to write the language. You know, they could write kanji and such. And that's how they existed over there and in Seattle. And so they were very, very Japanese. But as the older as the younger ones were born, of course, they became more and more Americanized.
Mhm.
And then my father was born. My father didn't go there to get educated, but he could speak the language, he could write the language, he was literate and such, but he never got further than high school in his education process. My father was very smart, very business oriented type person, and principled person, and so he passed this stuff on to us, you know. Um, and I have written a book to try to show all the future generations, you know, what our immigrant families went through. And so um, uh, Taka-chan was the first American born, and she was always considered to be very, very nice lady, and she was very well educated, and she helped Harua-san with a Japanese language school in Seattle. They had, I think, the first Japanese language school in Seattle, and the family was very much tied into the Buddhist church in Seattle. I think there may have been a couple of them. There's a big Buddhist church, and they had a big Boy Scout troop there, which was known for their drum and bugle corps. And several of my cousins and my uncles were involved in the um, drum and bugle corps. And of course, one of my cousins was an Eagle Scout. He wasn't part of the Nagaki clan. He was a Kurimoto, but his mother was a cousin to Kenjiro. And so that's Aki Nogaki, and that's the relationship we had. And it's very interesting because I think that Kua, my grandmother, was really responsible for encouraging a lot of Japanese families from our prefecture that we came from in Japan to come to America. And she helped them. And she was recognized for her devotion to the Japanese coming over. They came from Aichi Ken. That was the prefecture they lived in. And um, Nagoya was the main city, and it still is the main city in Aichi Ken. I've been to Aichi Ken. I've been to Nagoya. I have some friends that have been there and have told me about um, a hospital in Nagoya. It's part of our family. We don't, we haven't really communicated with that part of the family, but we have communicated with several parts of the Nagaki clan in Aichi Ken. And actually, the Nagaki family, the name Nagaki is not a very large family name. There's only about 1,000 of us in Japan today, and maybe another 100 or so here in America. So there's not that many of us Nagakis
So
worldwide.
you mentioned earlier that because you were quite young, you know, your perspective on both the Puyallup Assembly Center and later Minidoka is a little bit different, I'm sure, than your parents. What was camp like for your family? How did that affect your grandfather, your parents? Uh,
Okay.
and then I know when we were talking a couple days ago, you mentioned that because you have older cousins that you have been able to share some of their memories of camp with you, that it's helped you to remember more and to keep those memories alive. So
Yes.
share some of that with us as well.
Yeah, I have two cousins in particular
I had a very close relationship with. One is Yasko Ota. That's Nesima, big sister. That's her daughter. And Nesima had three children. Her oldest son was Koichi. We called him Ed. And they had another child who was a daughter, and she's deceased. She died at a very young age, 3 years old or something. And then there was Yasko, and Yasko was about 12 years older than me, and so she was born around 1928, somewhere around there, and she was in a freshman year of high school in Minidoka, and then there was Bob Kurimoto, and Bob Kurimoto and I uh, we were we were very close from the standpoint that we wrote to each other and spoke to each other on the phone. Of course, he lived almost all his life on the West Coast, and I lived most of my life, or almost all of my life, here on the East Coast. So we didn't really have too much of a physical connection, but we did through the means of telephone and such. And we did have a few reunions where I was able to get to meet him and his family and all. And I still am in contact with them. And we had a very, very close relationship. So we used to exchange notes about what I remembered. And they were always, amazed that I could remember some of these things because, I was so small. As an example, when we first got to Puyallup, I was telling you about the horses. Well, when we got there, my uh, we came down in a bus. We were, I don't know where we were, someplace in Seattle. We got on a bus and we rode this bus down there. My dad told me, "Oh, we're gonna see horses. There's horses down at this place." So when we got down there was no horses, but there was a lot of people. And he went away for a while. I guess he had to do some registration and such. And when he came back, he said, "Well, no, we have to go now and get our ticks filled up." Well, what's a tick? I don't know what a tick is. He says, "Well, but this is what we're going to sleep on. We're going to put hay, hay in this tick, and then we're going to sleep on it." I said, "Oh, horses eat hay." And he says, "Yes, that's what we're going to sleep on, is what horses eat." So I was all excited because I thought when we went down to fill these bags up, that we were going to fill them up with hay and sleep with the horses, but there was no horses. It was just us. And so that's what we slept on when we were in Puyallup. When we were there for several months, I guess 3 or 4 months in Puyallup, and then they moved us to Minidoka. When they moved us to Minidoka, we were sent by a train. We got on a train, and the windows in the train were covered with like newspaper. So you couldn't see out the window, and nobody could see in the window. Of course, we didn't know why. And when we got inside the train, we sat down, and there were guards at one end of the train where you came in, and where you got off the train at the other end, there was a couple of more guards. So they sat there with rifles. I didn't know what a rifle was, or they had bayonets. Well, I don't know what a bayonet is. And I was too little to understand what was going on. So my dad says, "Well, we're going to go to where we're going to be staying. We're going to stay at a new place." And so I think it took a couple of days by train. I'm not really sure because I think I was pretty tired and I probably conked out. And when we got to um, um, Minidoka, we had to get off the train, but then we had to get on buses and trucks to come to the camp. And when we got to the camp, of course, we're pretty tired from traveling and all. But I do remember going out there, buses. Some people went in trucks. I think we went, as I remember, we were in a bus. And when we got to to Minidoka, we were required to go to our cabin, I guess you call it. And it was pretty desolate. It was only one room I can remember. It had a big black uh, stove, and I didn't know what it was. And my dad explained to me, well, this is a stove to heat the apartment that we're going to be living in. And there was one light bulb in the thing, and it hung from a light coming down from the ceiling. And I can remember that it was a big long building, and I can remember a little smokestack up on top of the building. So I mean, I have memories. I don't have bad memories there. I mean, it wasn't a bad memory, but I didn't know what a good memory would have been either. Um, the bathrooms that we had to go to, well, there was no bathroom in the room. We had to go to a lavatory, and the first lavatory that we went to uh, was really an outhouse, and it had a board, a big plank, and it had holes cut into the board, and that's where you went to the bathroom. It was a big line, I guess about 3 feet away or so. There's another hole, and somebody else is at that hole, and uh, then where you took a shower, that was just like a room, and it had water. It was all cold water though, no hot water. And I didn't know anything about privacy and all that. I was just little. But that's how we first settled in to the bathrooms. And then at nighttime, if you had to go to the bathroom, they had like a can or something there. I can remember my mother having a towel or something over the top of it. And you peed in the can, And I guess for boys that's a lot of fun because I think we've all done that anyway, growing up. And and then as we got and then they had a laundry room, and they had these big tubs, big galvanized tub, and they had a washboard, and that's where my mom had how she did her laundry, by hand and scrubbing, and they have a brown bar of soap. I can remember that, and they would brush it on there and scrub it with the brush and scrub it on that board, And then as we got older, they got running water in there, and eventually they got hot water. But the men's room, there wasn't much privacy. In the women's room, there was a little bit of privacy, but not a whole lot. And I can remember when the bathrooms were finished, so-called finished, they had put stalls in them with a little door, And of course, my mother would take us to go to the bathroom and such, and sit down, and she'd supervise us. And I guess I was a bad boy because I used to get in there, and women would be in their bathroom, and I go and open the door, close the door, and they'd be yelling at me in Japanese, and I think that was so funny, People are all upset, and here I'm banging on the door and laughing, and they're going nuts, My mother's going nuts. She's smacking me in the head, and I just thought it was a lot of fun, hear all these old ladies screaming at me. They're still screaming at me, but now it's my wife and
Well,
our friends here at the Senior Living Center.
as a 4-year-old, I'm sure that there was a lot of opportunities to kind of get into maybe some good trouble in camp, and
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any memories of the mess hall and what you used to eat in camp.
Well, yeah. I think most of our meals my mom and dad would bring to us back from the mess hall, but I can remember going through the line, and you get your food, you get it, and you bring it out to the table and sit down and eat. And I don't remember that I liked the food very much, because at first there was not like rice. We didn't get rice. They fed us potatoes. I did not like mashed potatoes. They used to make us eat mashed potatoes. I didn't like that. I'm still not a big mashed potato eater. I mean, I'll eat it, but I'm not a big mashed potato eater. But they didn't have a whole lot of money to spend on food. And frankly, I think it's just like everybody else in America at the time. They had a hard time getting food. And that's why they decided to raise their own food. And Minidoka was a camp, one of the camps where they raised a lot of groceries, fresh vegetables and such, and potatoes and sweet potatoes and all kinds of beans and tomatoes and such. And they had a big dugout into the ground. It was like covered over with dirt, and it was a storage place to put groceries, food. And then they would ship it to other camps so that people have things to eat. They did eventually try to get more things, that would be things that the Japanese like to eat, like fish. And I know that there's some stories that I have in my book about food. And one of my uncles was over in Tule Lake, and they went through the same kind of thing. And they complained about the food and the quality and how much money was set aside, for food, and they weren't getting that kind of quality or amount of food back for the amount that they were setting aside for us. And um, you know, it's like eating in a cafeteria. The quality of the food wasn't very good. Um, you're cooking in mass. You don't have the foods that, what we're generally used to eating, the type of vegetables and such, because it's just not available. And so until we started growing our own foods, and I think then they were able to grow things like um,
Daikon, other Japanese
well, you know, Japanese vegetables and get things that we like to eat, like seafood and such. And I think all the camps had that kind of problem. So the food quality wasn't that great, but I guess it was sufficient enough to make everybody happy. Eventually, they grew their own chickens and pork at Minidoka. They had a farming thing there where they're able to grow that kind of food, and they also sent that stuff out to other camps to feed the other Japanese in the other places. And
Yeah.
also, a lot of the Japanese in our camp went to work on farms, um, cultivating, planting, and harvesting the crops. A lot of teenagers were able to go and do that, and that way they can get out of camp.
Mhm. So I know at some point soon we want to open up to questions from the audience, but I'm wondering if you might be able to share a little bit about your resettlement story with us, because not that many stories have been well documented about the families that resettled on the East Coast and stayed there. A lot of people who did come here initially wounded up in either the Pacific Northwest or in California after some
Right.
time. But your family stayed in North Jersey, just across the river, practically from New York City. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your family's resettlement journey and what it was like for you and your family living there at that time.
Well, to say it was a very, very interesting, as I look back now, it was a very interesting experience. How we got to North Jersey is interesting in itself, because when we left the camp, um, my father left in after Thanksgiving 1943, because in 1943 we were allowed to leave the camps and go east. We couldn't go back west. We couldn't go to the West Coast. Um, some of the Japanese um, elected to go east before we were evacuated. And one of them was my uncle Ken Matsumoto, who was the national vice president of JACL. And there was like a disagreement, I guess, on what we were going to do as a group between the Niseis and the Iseis. The Sanseis, those that were Sanseis, were pretty much like myself. They were either too little to say anything or weren't big enough to make a difference. And what happened was my family, my dad uh, tried to get a job working in a bank out east because he was a banker in Seattle. And because he worked for a Japanese bank, he worked for Sumitomo Bank, and he was like the head teller. All the managers were from Japan, and they all spoke Japanese. They spoke very little English. So my father ended up being like the liaison uh, floor worker in the bank, teller, and he became supervisor. I guess head teller is what his title was, and because he could deal with the management. But at any rate, when we came out in groups. My mother's brother and his wife and one of her sisters, Margaret, she became Margaret Iwatsu. I noticed we have an Iwatsu that's in our group here, and um, she she helped drive the family out of camp. So my cousin Lynn, who was my uncle's daughter, oldest daughter, um, was in the car, and they tell me about their trip going from Los Angeles all the way through Colorado, Denver, and on out. And it was a harrowing experience because every place they went to stop to go to the bathroom to get something to eat, they were always eventually met by the local sheriff or police. And they come out, and sheriff, as an example, he told me about how they stopped at this one place and it was cold, they were tired, they had to go to the bathroom, they were hungry, and he opened his shirt up and police, and he pulled his jacket back so that he could expose his gun. So there was a lot of intimidation and, saying it's, time for you to move on. And it was not a very happy um, trip. But he did have a job waiting for him in Cincinnati because he had been friends with some German jewelers in Los Angeles, and they said that they would help him set up a business. He was in the jewelry display business, and because he had that art capability, and my Aunt Margaret was an artist, uh, it worked out well. So she helped drive the family, Ken and his wife, and his daughter, um, out to Cincinnati. That's where they settled, and he had a business out in Cincinnati all during the war. And his main thing was first to get his family out of camp. And so he got um, my aunt in that was and their parents out of camp, and they brought them out of camp. They weren't in the Minidoka. I forgot the name of the camp they were in. At any rate, they came out of camp and they stayed with him in Cincinnati. My mother left the camp, left Minidoka in 1944. Um, my father had just gotten a job with a firm in New York City. He tried Chicago, he tried Philadelphia, and New York, and he settled on New York. He felt that the opportunities were best in New York. But he didn't get a job at a bank. My father, his first job out east was working for a Jewish ladies garment business. It was a chain of ladies wear stores in the New York metropolitan area. I think there was like 60 some stores. So he got a job with a outfit called Ralph E. Miller, and that were a ladies wear store. And Mr. Miller took my father in because he says he wanted to help Japanese Americans because his family, they were Jewish, and they had been exposed to the same kinds of things that we were going through, but in Europe, where they were, what happened to them in Europe was, you can't, it magnified many times differently than what we did, but we were both in concentration camps.
Mhm.
Theirs was a death camp, ours wasn't. So that was probably the big difference. But he wanted to help the Japanese Americans get out of camp, and my father was one of the recipients. So that's how we got out. And then we settled in New York, and we were helped in New York by the Friends, the Quakers. And there was a group, and they took us in. I can remember the first place that we went to in New York City was a walk up. We had to walk up into I called it a flop house. You know, we had a room up there, and we had a single bed. My mother put three of us in that bed, and they had another room, and that was where she and my father were. But she says at night, she says she can remember the bed bugs would be crawling around, and they were busy killing the bed bugs so they didn't bite me and my brothers. And we were there for 2 nights, and then we went to this hostel in Brooklyn, New York, in Greenpoint, New York. And that's where we stayed for about a month. And then from there, we moved to an apartment on West 113th Street in Manhattan, which was in the lower part of Harlem, where Columbia University was. And I've looked up that place where we stayed, and we stayed in like I think it was a 2-bedroom walk-up apartment, and I think we were on like the 5th floor or something. I remember it was a lot of stairs, and we used to play out on the fire escape, and that's what we did. We used to run in fire escape on one side and come running in off the fire escape on the other. And I can remember it caused such a ruckus because the lady across the street saw us, and she was exasperated that she thought that the fire escape was going to fall over, and we'd fall over with the doggone thing. She called the police, and oh. But at any rate, I wanted to tell you about my mother, because my mother brought us across country. There was 3 of us kids. My brother Brian, who was 10 months old and was born in the camp. My brother Warren, who was like about a year and a half, 2 years old, 2 years old. And then myself, I was like 4 years old. And, you know, her coming across country by herself with the 3 of us was really an extraordinary thing. And we could only carry the bags that we could carry. That's what we brought out. And my mother could only carry 1 bag because she's carrying Brian in her arms. And Warren had a harness on, and he had a rope harness. A rope was attached to the harness, and she held on one end of the harness, and the other end was on his back. And then there was me. I was the helper because I was dragging around her other suitcase or whatever, clothes bag. And that's how we came across the country. And we stopped off in Chicago. She made a phone call from Chicago to her brother to pick us up in Cincinnati and tell him what train we're going to be on and that stuff. And on the way out to Cincinnati, there was a German prisoner of war on the train, and he had 3 guards, and I can remember it to this day. That guy had he had his uniform, and all his epaulets and such were all torn off of him. And he was very friendly. He looked like he needed a shave, you know, and he was very nice. He was clean and all, but he couldn't speak. They wouldn't let him speak. And he, you know, we went up to him because he's a soldier, and he's got handcuffs on, and he's got feet cuffs on, and chains. He's got chains from his hands to his waist, and then down to his feet. And so he took out a box of candy out of his pocket, and he opened it up, and he offered us the candy, and the guy said, "No, gotta wait," and asked the mother. So we came over to my mother and asked her, and she says, "Yeah, it was okay." So he brought us over, and he gave us a couple pieces of candy, you know, like this. they were like a caramel candy, and they had a little insignia on it. I didn't know what it was. And so we each got a piece of candy, and we thought that was wonderful. And when the train pulled into Cincinnati train station, it came in real slow. And as we came up to the, what do you call it, the landing area, um, they jumped off, and they hustled this guy off someplace. We could see him as we're going down the track there at the boarding area and offloading area. And later on, after I grew up, and I realized the insignia that I saw on this candy was a swastika. And so that was first time I ever saw a swastika was on this piece of candy. It was a good candy too. And that's we lived with my uncle and aunt in Cincinnati. So
Well, what a story. And I feel like we're just barely scratching the surface, but I'm sure folks on this call have some questions.
sure.
We'd welcome people to either put them in the chat, or I think you can unmute yourself and ask Rodger directly if anyone has any questions. I saw one in the chat earlier. It was whether your middle name, Ken, was inspired by your grandfather, Kenjiro.
Yes. That was the name of a lot of the people in our family. I have Uncle Kenji, Uncle Ken. Well, that was a Matsumoto, but both families had the Ken. An aunt, Kenko. And so naturally, firstborn, they want to make sure that name gets in there. And so that's how I got named Ken. I didn't even know my name was Ken until I was well into school, in New Jersey. That was another thing, was moving over from New York to New Jersey, to our first home. My dad got a home over there because some of the people that he worked with were from New Jersey, and they felt that there was a couple of communities where we would be accepted. And one of the communities was a place called Bergenfield, which is 6 miles from the George Washington Bridge. And that was about the only community that would even allow my mom and dad to look at homes. And so that's where they looked, and they found a home and nice little neighborhood. And we moved in, and when we moved in, there was a bunch of people across the street from the house, all lined up, all there looking at us. We got out of the truck when we got there, and not one person said hello. Nobody said anything. Nobody said a word. We got out of the truck, and the guys were unloading the truck and bringing the stuff into the house. Nobody ever said anything. Kind of a cold reception. Eventually, we did make some friends. Lady next door to us had a dog, big German Shepherd. Her name was Mrs. Carroll, and she had a brother-in-law who was a priest, Catholic priest. He was from St. Louis. He was a bishop, Bishop Carroll, and he used to come over to the house periodically. He would come and visit her, and he'd come with a big entourage. And the only other Catholic that we had been involved with in camp was Father Tibisar. And Father Tibisar was a Maryknoll priest, and he was very helpful to not only to our family but to others who were leaving the camp. And he's the one who took us from the camp to the train station and put us on the train, and told us that when we got to New York City, he was a letter of introduction to go see this other Maryknoll priest, and he would help us get a place to stay and all. But my father had already been working with the friends, and so he, graciously thanked him for that help, that he had it all planned out. So that's how we got involved. The Maryknoll priests were they were the only ones that I can remember, Catholics, that were in there in the camp helping us. And the other group of people, of course, were the Friends, the Quakers. They were quietly involved. They were our medical staff, and they were our educators in our school. And we had like elementary, high school classes, and I even have a copy of their high school yearbook for 1943, and it's a very interesting book to look at. I look in there, and I actually found my cousin Yasko, her picture in there. She was in there, and ninth grade. She was a ninth grader, and it's interesting the things that they had in that book. You look at it and you say, Jesus, this looks like my yearbook when I was in high school. They have kids by class, and who the class president was, and the prom queen, and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of nice to see that. But on the other hand, you look at that, and it breaks your heart to think that these kids were.
Yeah, it's a testament to the community, right? To be able to have such tremendous resilience
Yes,
in a time of such difficulty, but to do whatever they could to have normalcy in their lives.
right. And it's a blessing to think that somebody was thinking about us. And I think that's one of the other reasons why I decided to write this book that I wrote. Excuse me, I'll be right back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Wendy. I just wanted to ask Rodger a question when he gets a minute, if it's okay.
By all means.
Okay.
Can I just say hi to everyone and to all my cousins?
Misty! Misty, I started to put this in the chat, but I was curious, was that connection between the Iwatsus and Nogakis and Aichiken, was that the reason that Aunt Margaret and Uncle John were introduced? Is that the connection?
I have no idea. Claire would know that probably better than me.
Okay.
Well,
And maybe your dad.
Dad, I wanted to ask one quick question too about your family's relationship to religion and how that changed from when you were in Seattle to reintegrating, into American life after the war. And I know that you received help from Quakers during the camps and afterwards. And but I know that both of your parents were very spiritual people, and I wanted to know if churches generally stepped in to help your family reintegrate.
well, my father and mother always said to us that it was important that we belong to a church in our community. They said it wasn't necessary that we had to do that, but it was a good thing to be a part of the community, and part of that was having some kind of a participation and respect for other churches. So that's what we did. My mother and father. My father was a Buddhist. My mother was a Protestant. She belonged to a church. Oh, all I remember is that the church was the church that Jim Jones belonged to, but they had a ministry in Los Angeles, where she grew up, and you know, it's part of our growing up in New Jersey. We belonged to a church. My mother and father, my father became a Christian, and he was a founding member of a Methodist church in Bergenfield where we lived, and that was part of the whole thing, was to be part of the church. My uncle John Iwatsu, who was married to my Aunt Margaret, and I think that may have been kind of like a arranged marriage between the Iwatsu grandparents and the Matsumoto grandparents. Watsus were from San Francisco, as I remember, and the Matsumotos were from Los Angeles. But somehow or another, there was a connection, and Uncle John married Aunt Margaret, and around the same time, or maybe the year before, Uncle, let's see, David married Misty's mother, and I don't know what that connection was, but I know Uncle David was in the Navy. He eventually became a Navy officer, but he was first in the submarine corps right after the war, and when the war ended in 1946, President Truman integrated the military forces. They all became one. They didn't have like black units and Asian units and Filipino units, and you know, if you were Japanese or Chinese or whatever, you couldn't become a Marine, or you couldn't serve as a Navy officer. You were relegated to being a servant. You know, they were the guys who washed the dishes and took out the trash and did all the dirty work, and that's what the Filipinos and the Asians did in the Navy. The Marines, they couldn't be in that. Of course, the Air Force was part of the Army, and there were a couple of guys that actually served in World War II that were in the Army Air Corps, and they were the first ones that served in that capacity. So it's interesting. I'm sorry, I got a little overwhelmed by this stuff, but I just wanted to get this book just to show you, you know, like some of the pictures of, this is what their high school yearbook looked like, you know, and it looks like our yearbooks that we have today, and it's, you know, they have the same kind of things, you know, it's just amazing. You know, here's their school.
Yeah.
And this is called the Memoirs. And I think each one of the camps had something similar to this. And then for the grown-ups, they had a book. It's called Interlude. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's called the Interlude. And it had like different things in it, all different kinds of groups that were in the camp, clubs and sporting groups, and you know, they even showed like the different places where we all lived. You know, this is the different barracks that we lived in, to give you an idea of what it looked like. And I put it in my book. I wrote this book, and I see that my editor, Wendy Thornton, who helped me put this book together, this is the book that we came out with. And there's my wife and I.
I know
And
Wendy
so-
has a question for you, Rodger.
Yeah. Okay.
First of all, I just want to say how amazing it is that you remember so much of this. It's incredible. Your memory is amazing. But also, do you see this is probably a stupid question. Do you see a parallel between what happened to you guys and what's going on now?
Definitely. You know, and it
Me
really
too.
dawned, I mean, that is really a great question. It really dawned on me. And I look back because I moved down here to Florida with my wife. She made me retire and close my business up and
Yay.
quit working. And so we came down here and I learned about, went to some historical meetings in the area about our Native Americans that lived here in Florida and in the southeast of the United States. And when I started hearing the stories of what those people went through, it is exactly the same thing that happened to the Japanese Americans in this country. And you know, when I think about all the heartache, you know, it's hard. I mean, as a parent, you think back, you want to do all the right things for your kid, and you know, you're treated like trash, and your kids are treated like trash, and that really, you know, riled me up. And my wife, you know, people would say things to her like, you know, well, why'd you marry this guy? You know, I mean, um, did you adopt those kids? Well, we didn't adopt those kids. Those are our kids, you know. And you know, say things, nasty things to the kids as they go to school, and we're doing the same thing today. You know, there is no reason why in this country, as rich as this country is, that we have so much hate and so much divisiveness and saying terrible things about other people. You know, we're a better people than that. We don't have to say bad things about other people. You know, we should be saying good things and we should be setting the example of what being kind to other people really means. And you know, this, you know, things that have gone on is not what I remember. And I've written in my book, I wrote about in the early part of the book, introducing it, I wrote about the four pillars of democracy. And you know what? People should people should study some of these things about what these things mean. And you know, the four pillars of democracy. I have a whole chapter on it. Go to page 10, and it's about freedom, justice, um, equity, and representation. I think that our politicians should read something about our democracy and study it. And maybe they wouldn't be such blunderbuss as they are today. It's a shame that we do the kind of things that we're doing to foreigners, you know, and saying disgusting things about them as if everybody who is a foreigner is a lawbreaker and a child molester and you know, that's not what all these people are. They're like our people. My grandfather, he came to this country because he was so dead poor and he had no opportunities available to him. He came to this country as a 13-year-old runaway. And to see people do the kind of things that we're doing today in this country and try to justify it is just beyond my imagination that we have these people. You know, I think my daughter was asking questions about religion. Well, there's a reason why I'm not a member of a church today. And it doesn't mean that I have not done significant things in my community, because I have all my life. I've been a scouter. I'm an Eagle Scout myself, but I work with kids as a merit badge counselor, as a Boy Scout a committee member, even though I didn't have any boys. I didn't have any kids at the time, and I was still a scout volunteer. And excuse me. I've been a fireman. I've been a fire chief. Probably the first Asian American to be a fire chief. At least that's I was told that. You're probably the first guy to ever become a fire chief, and you're an Asian American. I said, well, maybe so. I says, I don't know of any, but yeah, I am a fire chief, elected a fire chief, and I've been a fire commissioner. I've been an advisor to the city of Philadelphia's fire commissioner, a civilian advisor to him under Joe Rizzo's tenure as mayor. And, you know, um, I've been a volunteer director of a volunteer um, sheriff's department. I worked down here in Florida as a volunteer, as a director of the volunteers, sheriff's volunteers, and did patrols every week. I went out for patrols. I'd spend, 20, 30 hours a week on patrol and never got a penny for it. I helped with 4-H clubs, the judo instructor. I taught judo and I taught for about 40 years. Never ever took one penny for myself teaching judo and jujitsu. I was always a volunteer. I was so proud to be a volunteer to teach others about how to defend yourself and how to control yourself. And I needed that kind of education because I was such a hothead myself. I mean, there was never a time when I was growing up as a kid that if somebody need protection, who do they come to in the neighborhood? I don't care what color they were. They'd always come to see me. And I'm not the big guy, I'm the little guy. And that's who they would come to. And it's amazing, that I was able to do that. And I'm glad that I was around to be able to do it. And I got my lumps too, but I'm still here and I'm 85 years old and I'm still going.
Thank you for sharing so many incredible stories with us,
Yeah.
Rodger. I don't know if anyone else had any last questions that they wanted to get in here as we come to the end of our session today.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I have really enjoyed talking about it. And thank you, Wendy, for being so helpful to me and putting my book together. I think we really got a good one there. And I really appreciate your help and your guidance. Thank you very much. But
I
that's
love
the
doing
lady
it.
right there.
And I know it's been shared a couple times in the chat, but can you just tell us all the name of your book, Rodger?
Yes, it's called The Nogaki Family, An American Journey. And that's our family logo right there.
Great. And we can purchase that on Amazon, right?
Yes, it's available on Amazon. And there's a lot that I haven't talked about, and I haven't talked a lot about the Awatsu family, but they were very, very close part of my growing up, and a lot of the characteristics that my parents taught us. My mom and dad emphasized the 8 values of our family, and I think Mitzi, if you read the book, you'll probably say, well, those look very familiar to me, because I think that's more or less the philosophy that has been followed by Japanese um, um, from Japan and to this country. And I'm sure, Rob, that you read this thing, you'll probably see some similarities yourself. It's
Sure.
got to be, And
Well, thank you, Rodger, and I look forward to reading your book. I'm sure everyone else here who hasn't yet is gonna go right to Amazon and pick up a copy after this call ends.
yeah, and I have given a lot of talks. I've been to some universities, graduate school programs, and talked about my experiences, and um, I've talked to church groups, and I've talked to library groups, and been at schools, and I've been to prisons and talked to prisoners about what I've gone through, and addressing some of the things that meet in prisons and such, and I've had very good reception wherever I've gone. Old folks' homes, like the place that I live in now, and so it's been an interesting experience.
Well, thank you very much, Rodger. We appreciate your time and all the stories that you've shared with us. We're so glad that you were able to participate in Tadaima 2025. And thank you to all our participants for being here.